40 men were hired to control the Mafia Boss's Stallion, elite hands, iron nerves, and expensive training. Yet they failed miserably one after another as the animal turned the yard into pure chaos, and the Mafia Boss watched in cold, tightening silence. Then the Maid stepped forward. No spotlight, no permission, just a steady gaze. And in seconds, what fear couldn't touch, she calmed, redirected, and claimed, and everyone understood at once. The power in this house had just shifted. The morning silence of Napa Valley shattered like glass. 40 men scattered across the corral like leaves in a storm, their shouts piercing the air as a massive black stallion reared against the California sun. Onyx, 2,000 pounds of pure terror, crashed against the steel rails with a sound that echoed off the hills like thunder. His hooves struck earth and metal with the rhythm of a war drum, each impact sending tremors through the ground. "Get the tranquilizer," someone screamed, but the words were lost in the chaos. Security guards pressed against the outer fence, their radios crackling with panic. Horse trainers, men who had gentled wild mustangs and broken champion thoroughbreds, stood frozen, their experience useless against this tempest of fear and fury. Onyx spun in tight circles, his coal-black coat slick with sweat, foam flying from his mouth as he fought invisible demons. The ranch hands had tried everything. Ropes lay scattered and torn across the dusty ground. Her overturned bucket leaked oats into the dirt. Someone's hat had been trampled into the earth, crushed beneath hooves that knew no mercy. The morning had begun with routine feeding, but Onyx had exploded into madness the moment the gate opened, as if touched by lightning. From the third-floor window of the limestone mansion, Dominic Caruso watched the scene unfold with surgical stillness. His grey eyes tracked every movement below. The stumbling men, the panicked animal, the growing crowd of expensive specialists who had promised him solutions. His hands remained steady on the windowsill, but his jaw tightened with each failed attempt to contain the stallion. 24 hours ago, Dominic had owned the most successful vineyard in the valley. He controlled shipping routes from here to New York, influenced wine markets across 3 continents, and commanded respect from men who bent nations to their will. But standing in his silk-lined office, watching chaos reign in his own backyard, he felt the unfamiliar taste of powerlessness. The horse trainer from Kentucky stumbled backward as Onyx lunged toward the fence, missing his face by inches. The man's confidence, worth $200,000 a year, crumbled as he pressed himself against the rails. Another expert, flown in from Montana at dawn, shook his head and backed away, his reputation meaningless against the stallion's raw terror. Onyx wasn't attacking them. Dominic could see that much. The animal's eyes weren't filled with aggression, but with something deeper, more primal. Fear so absolute, it had transformed into something that looked like fury. The stallion crashed against the barriers not to escape, but because every shadow, every movement, every human voice triggered something broken inside him. "Sir?" Marcus, Dominic's head of security, appeared in the doorway. His usually composed face showed cracks of concern. "The veterinarian is asking for authorization to use heavy sedation." Dominic didn't turn from the window. Below, Onyx had backed into a corner, his massive frame trembling. The stallion's head swung from side to side, searching for threats that existed only in his mind. 40 of the most capable men Dominic's money could buy surrounded that corral, and none of them understood what they were looking at. "Not yet," Dominic said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. He had accepted this horse as a gift, or perhaps a curse, from the Harrington family 6 months ago. A gesture of respect, they had called it, after the death of the old patriarch. But Dominic knew better. In their world, gifts were weapons wrapped in silk. The horse had belonged to Richard Harrington himself, a man whose death had left more questions than answers. Refusing the animal would have been seen as weakness. Accepting it had been an act of pride. Now pride tasted like ash in his mouth. Onyx reared again, his hooves cutting through the morning air like scythes. The sound of his scream, part rage, part desperation, carried across the valley like a battle cry. It was the sound of something wild and magnificent being slowly destroyed by its own terror. Dominic's fingers pressed against the cool glass of the window. He had built his empire on understanding power, how to wield it, how to survive it, how to make others bend beneath its weight. But looking down at that broken stallion, He confronted a truth that cut deeper than any business rival or family enemy ever could. Sometimes, all the power in the world wasn't enough to heal what had been shattered. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the corral where 40 men stood defeated by one terrified horse. And in the mansion above, Dominic Caruso, a man accustomed to solving every problem with influence, money, or calculated force, faced the first challenge that couldn't be conquered, only survived. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Tap like, share your thoughts on the story in the comments, and tell us which city you're watching from. Now, let's continue the story. Harper Sullivan had learned to move through the world like smoke, present but unnoticed, essential but invisible. She pressed her back against the stone wall of the mansion's east wing, watching the chaos in the corral below through a narrow window that belonged to the servants' corridor. Her breath fogged the glass as she counted the men scattering like startled birds. 43, she always counted. Numbers were safer than names, distances safer than connections. Her fingers traced the worn fabric of her uniform, grey cotton that had seen too many wash cycles, too many invisible days. The Caruso estate had hired her 3 weeks ago through an agency that specialized in discretion. No background checks that dug too deep, no questions about the gaps in her employment history, no curiosity about why a woman with her skills worked for half the going rate. The screaming of the stallion cut through the morning air, and Harper's chest tightened with recognition. She knew that sound, had heard it in her own throat years ago when the world had collapsed around her and left her scrambling through the wreckage. Her phone buzzed against her hip. A text from the care facility in Fresno. "Emma asking for you again. Nurse says she had a rough night." Harper closed her eyes, pressing the phone against her chest. Her sister, 24 years old with the mind of a child, trapped in a body that had stopped developing after the accident. The accident that Harper still carried like a stone in her chest, heavy and sharp-edged, cutting her from the inside every time she tried to breathe too deeply. "Tell her I'll call tonight," she typed back, though they both knew Emma wouldn't remember the conversation by morning. The brain injury had stolen more than her sister's future. It had hollowed out her ability to hold on to moments, leaving her perpetually lost in a present that reset itself every few hours. The care facility cost $4,000 a month. Harper's salary here covered $3,000. The difference came from the small savings account she'd been draining for 2 years, watching the numbers shrink like sand through her fingers. 6 months left, maybe 7 if she skipped more meals. She had become an expert in invisibility by necessity. Growing up in the foster system had taught her that being noticed often meant being hurt. Being forgotten meant being safe. When she aged out at 18, she'd carried that lesson into every job, every apartment, every relationship that never quite formed because she couldn't afford the luxury of being seen. Below in the corral, the stallion crashed against the rails again, and Harper winced. The animal wasn't angry. Anyone with eyes could see that. He was trapped inside his own terror, fighting shadows that existed only in his mind. She recognized the signs because she'd worn them herself, for years after the accident, after the court proceedings, after the night she'd realized that sometimes loving someone meant carrying the weight of their broken pieces forever. The mansion around her hummed with quiet efficiency. She'd spent 3 weeks learning its rhythms, which hallways the family used, which rooms stayed empty, which corners offered the best hiding spots when the important people moved through their important lives. The other staff treated her with the casual indifference reserved for temporary help. She preferred it that way. Mrs. Chen, the head housekeeper, had assigned Harper to the East Wing, guest rooms that rarely saw guests, libraries that collected more dust than readers. It was perfect exile, the kind of work that let her disappear into routine while her mind stayed focused on the numbers. Emma's medication costs, the rent on her studio apartment, the car payment that kept her mobile enough to work. She pulled out her phone again and opened her banking app. The balance stared back at her like an accusation. $2,147.23. Counting today's shift, she'd made $180 this week. After taxes, gas, and her own minimal expenses, maybe $140 would be left for Emma's care. Not enough. Never enough. The sound from the corral shifted. Less chaos, more exhaustion. Harper looked through the window again and saw that the Stallion had backed into a corner, his massive frame trembling. Steam rose from his coat in the cool morning air, and his sides heaved like bellows. The men had backed away, creating a wide circle of respectful distance. He's not fighting anymore, she thought. He's just scared. Harper had spent enough nights in emergency rooms and therapy waiting rooms to recognize the difference. After the accident, Emma's accident, though the lawyers had been careful to explain that legally it was Harper's fault, she'd learned to read the language of trauma. The way it lived in a body, changed breathing patterns made the world feel like a trap with no exits. Her sister had been 17, home from school with a fever. Harper had been 21, working 2 jobs and taking night classes, trying to build something stable for both of them. Their foster family had aged them out years before, and Harper had been Emma's only constant in a world that shuffled children like cards. "Just run to the pharmacy," Emma had said that afternoon, curled up on their second-hand couch. "The fever's not breaking." Harper had been exhausted from a double shift, her reflexes dulled by months of sleeping 4 hours a night. She'd taken the turn too fast on wet pavement, hit the ice patch that would replay in her nightmares for years. The car had rolled twice before coming to rest against an oak tree that was probably older than both of them combined. She'd walked away with bruises and cuts. Emma had woken up 3 days later with a brain injury that rewrote the trajectory of both their lives. My fault, Harper reminded herself, the way she did every morning, my choices, my consequences. But watching the Stallion below, something shifted in her chest. She recognized the way he held himself, like something hunted, something that had learned to expect pain from every direction. The men surrounding him saw a problem to be solved, a dangerous animal to be controlled. They didn't see what Harper saw, a creature so lost in his own terror that he'd forgotten how to find his way back to stillness. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from the facility. "Don't worry about tonight's call." Emma fell asleep. "We'll try again tomorrow." Harper tucked the phone away and pressed her palm against the cool window glass. Below, the Stallion lifted his head and seemed to look directly at her, though she knew the distance made that impossible. For a moment, she felt the strange sensation of being seen, not as Harper, the invisible housekeeper, but as someone who understood what it meant to carry more than you could hold. The moment passed. The Stallion looked away, and Harper stepped back from the window, returning to the shadows where she belonged. But something had changed in that brief exchange of recognition, a crack in the armor she'd built around herself, small but significant. She gathered her cleaning supplies and moved deeper into the mansion's quiet corridors, carrying the image of the Stallion's eyes with her like a secret. Dominic Caruso's world was built on precision. Every morning at 6:15, he stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching the sun paint the valley gold. His coffee, Colombian ground to exact specifications, steamed in a cup that had been warmed to precisely 140 degrees. The financial reports on his desk were arranged by priority, each page crisp and unmarked by human hesitation. Control was not just preference, it was survival. At 38, Dominic commanded an empire that stretched far beyond the vineyard's rolling hills. Caruso Holdings owned shipping lanes, influenced agricultural markets across 3 continents, and maintained partnerships with families whose names appeared in history books alongside wars and revolutions. When he spoke, senators listened. When he moved money, markets trembled. But empires, he had learned, were built on blood as much as brilliance. The scar along his left temple, barely visible now, hidden beneath precisely styled hair, served as a daily reminder of the night he'd discovered that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. 5 years ago, a business partner had sold information about Dominic's shipping routes to their competitors. The ambush at the Oakland docks had left 2 men dead, and Dominic with a bullet graze that missed his skull by millimeters. He'd survived because he'd learned to think 3 moves ahead of everyone else. The partner had not survived because Dominic had learned that mercy was often just delayed justice. Now, as he watched his security team regroup around the corral below, Dominic felt the familiar weight of absolute responsibility. 43 employees depended on his decisions, hundreds more across his various enterprises. Thousands of families whose livelihoods connected to his choices in ways they would never understand. The Stallion, Onyx, represented something different, a problem that couldn't be solved with money, influence, or carefully applied pressure. For 6 months, the horse had been a source of frustration and, if Dominic was honest, growing embarrassment. The best trainers in the country had failed. Veterinarians had found nothing wrong physically. The animal simply existed in a state of perpetual terror that no amount of expertise could penetrate. Marcus appeared in the doorway again, his usually composed expression tight with concern. "Sir, the Kentucky trainer is requesting permission to leave. He says the animal is—" Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "Beyond professional help." Dominic didn't turn from the window. "What's our investment in that particular expert?" $200,000 over 6 months plus expenses. $200,000 to watch a man abandon his reputation in a cloud of dust and defeat. Dominic had made worse investments, but few had stung his pride so precisely. In his world, problems had solutions, obstacles had prices, enemies had weaknesses that could be exploited. But Onyx defied every equation Dominic understood. "Cancel his contract," Dominic said quietly. "Full payment, plus a bonus for discretion." Marcus nodded and withdrew, leaving Dominic alone with the morning and his thoughts. The office around him reflected his need for order. Leather-bound books arranged by height, awards positioned at exact angles, family photographs limited to one. His mother, Maria, taken the year before her death. The cancer had eaten her slowly, stealing pieces of the woman who had raised him alone after his father's murder when Dominic was 12. She had been fierce, protective, willing to work 3 jobs to keep them in their small apartment overlooking the bay. But in the end, all her strength, all her love, hadn't been enough to stop the disease that turned her body against itself. "Promise me," she had whispered during her final week, her hand gripping his with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll be more than what this world tries to make you." He had promised. And then spent 15 years becoming exactly what the world demanded. Harder than his enemies, richer than his competitors, more ruthless than anyone who might threaten what he'd built. The irony wasn't lost on him that his mother's medical bills had provided the motivation for his first truly profitable but morally questionable deal. Maria Caruso had died in a private room with round-the-clock nursing care, never knowing that her son had sold his soul to pay for her comfort. Now, standing in an office that cost more than most people's houses, Dominic wondered what she would think of the man he'd become. Would she recognize the boy who had held her hand through chemotherapy sessions? Or would she see only the calculation in his eyes, the way he measured every relationship against its potential value? His phone chimed with a text from his business manager. Harrington Industries made another offer on the East Ridge property. Same price, different terms. Dominic deleted the message without responding. The Harringtons had been circling his holdings like vultures ever since Richard's death, testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses. The horse had been their opening gambit, a gesture of respect that felt more like a Trojan horse with each passing day. They wanted him to fail publicly, wanted the story of Dominic Caruso, the man who could move mountains but couldn't gentle one traumatized animal. It would make excellent gossip at their country club gatherings, perfect ammunition for their whisper campaigns. Let them whisper, he thought. I've survived worse. But even as the thought formed, Dominic felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the armor he'd spent years perfecting. The stallion's terror reminded him of something he'd tried to forget, the feeling of being powerless, of watching something precious slip away despite every effort to hold on. Below in the corral, the chaos had evolved into exhausted standoff. Onyx stood in the far corner, his coat dark with sweat, sides heaving. The men had given up their aggressive approaches and now simply watched, hoping exhaustion would succeed where expertise had failed. Dominic placed his palm against the cool window glass, studying the animal that had become his most expensive failure. Somewhere in that corral was a lesson he wasn't ready to learn, a truth that threatened the foundations of everything he'd built. Control was illusion. Power was temporary. And sometimes the strongest thing a man could do was admit that strength alone wasn't enough. But admitting that would mean acknowledging the 12-year-old boy still hiding inside him, the one who had watched his father bleed out on a dock in Oakland, the one who had promised his dying mother that he would be better than the world expected. Dominic Caruso had built an empire on the promise that he would never be helpless again. The stallion below represented the possibility that some things, the most important things, couldn't be conquered, only healed. And healing, he was beginning to suspect, required something he had spent years learning to suppress: the willingness to be vulnerable enough to understand another's pain. The breaking point came at 11:37. Harper was polishing silver in the main dining room when the sound reached her. Not the familiar chaos of men shouting, but something worse. Silence, then a single voice, sharp with panic. "He's down! The horse is down!" She dropped the candlestick and ran. By the time she reached the corral, a crowd had gathered around the fallen stallion. Onyx lay on his side in the dust, his massive frame eerily still except for the rapid rise and fall of his ribs. Foam flecked his mouth, and his eyes, those wild, terrified eyes, stared at nothing. "Exhaustion," someone said. "Finally gave out." "Could be cardiac distress," another voice added. "Should we call the vet?" Harper pressed through the circle of observers, her uniform marking her as invisible help beneath notice. But when she saw Onyx up close, her breath caught. The stallion wasn't unconscious. His eyes tracked movement, his ears swiveled toward sounds. He was awake, aware, and completely paralyzed by his own terror. "Move back, please." Dr. Bennett, the estate veterinarian, pushed past Harper with his medical bag. "Give me room to work." Harper watched as the doctor knelt beside Onyx, checking vitals, preparing what looked like a sedative. The stallion's breathing grew more rapid, his eyes rolling white with panic at the approaching stranger. "No," Harper said quietly. Dr. Bennett looked up, annoyed. "Excuse me." "He's not sick," Harper continued, her voice stronger now. "He's terrified. The sedative will make it worse." The doctor's expression hardened. "Miss, I think I know how to handle a medical emergency. Please step back." But Harper couldn't step back. Something in Onyx's eyes reached across the space between species and grabbed her by the heart. She recognized that look, had seen it in her own mirror during the months after Emma's accident, when even the sound of car keys could send her into a panic spiral. "He's not having a medical emergency," she insisted, moving closer to the fence. "He's having a panic attack." "That's enough." Marcus, Dominic's security chief, stepped forward. "You need to leave. Now." Harper looked around the circle of faces. Expensive experts, trained professionals, men accustomed to solving problems with authority and force. None of them saw what she saw, a creature drowning in his own mind, beyond the reach of medicine or expertise. From somewhere above she felt eyes watching, Dominic Caruso, no doubt, observing another failure in his investment. The decision came without thought, driven by something deeper than logic. Harper slipped under the corral fence. "Hey!" Marcus lunged forward, but Harper was already moving toward the fallen horse. "Miss Sullivan, stop!" Dr. Bennett called. "It's dangerous." But Harper had spent 3 years learning to move around trauma without triggering it. She approached Onyx sideways, making herself small, her movements slow and deliberate. When she spoke, her voice carried the gentle rhythm she'd used with Emma during the worst nights. "I know," she whispered to the stallion. "I know you're scared. I know everything feels like too much." She knelt in the dust beside Onyx's massive head, close enough that his panicked breathing warmed her face. The crowd behind her fell silent, watching what looked like certain disaster unfold. Harper reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a piece of apple from her lunch, a luxury she'd allowed herself because Emma loved hearing about the fancy food at the estate. She held it in her open palm, not offering it, just letting the scent reach Onyx's nostrils. "Nobody's going to hurt you," she continued, her voice barely audible. "Not while I'm here." Slowly, impossibly, Onyx's breathing began to steady. His wild eyes found Harper's face and held. She didn't move, didn't demand, didn't try to control. She simply existed beside his terror, without adding to it. Minutes passed. The watching crowd forgot to breathe. Then, with infinite care, Onyx lifted his great head and touched his muzzle to Harper's palm. The apple disappeared in one gentle bite, and the stallion rolled to his feet with surprising grace. He stood quietly beside Harper, no longer the terrified creature who had traumatized 40 men, Just a horse, breathing calmly, connected to someone who understood that sometimes healing meant sitting with the fear instead of fighting it. The silence stretched until Marcus's radio crackled. "Sir wants to see her. The girl, in his office. Now." Harper looked up at the mansion's third floor, where she could just make out a figure in the window. Dominic Caruso had been watching, had seen her succeed where his experts failed, had witnessed something that would change both their lives, though neither of them understood it yet. She stood slowly, brushing dust from her uniform, and walked toward whatever came next. Dominic's office felt like a cathedral of power, soaring ceilings, marble floors that swallowed footsteps, and windows that framed the valley like expensive paintings. Harper stood in the center of the room, acutely aware of the dust on her uniform, and the weight of 43 sets of eyes that had watched her succeed where trained professionals had failed. "Sit," Dominic said, without looking up from the financial reports spread across his mahogany desk. Harper remained standing. In her experience, sitting meant accepting vulnerability, and she couldn't afford that luxury. Not here, not with a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm front. "You handled my horse," he said finally, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being heard the first time. "Yes, sir. 42 experts, 6 months, $200,000. Dominic's grey eyes lifted to meet hers. "You did in 10 minutes what none of them accomplished." Harper waited. She had learned that silence was often safer than explanation, especially when powerful men were calculating her value. "Tell me about your background with horses." "I don't have one, not professionally." Something shifted in Dominic's expression, surprise perhaps or annoyance. "Then explain what happened down there." Harper chose her words carefully. Onyx wasn't being aggressive. He was terrified. "There's a difference." "Enlighten me." "Aggression comes from strength. Terror comes from helplessness. You can't fight helplessness with force. You have to—" She paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound naive. "You have to make it feel safe to stop fighting." Dominic leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "And how does someone learn that distinction without professional training?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Harper could deflect, maintain her carefully constructed invisibility, or she could offer truth to a man who likely collected secrets like other people collected art. "Experience," she said quietly. "Personal experience." "Yes." Dominic nodded, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. He stood and moved to the windows, his hands clasped behind his back. From this height, the corral looked like a toy. Onyx, a small dark figure grazing peacefully. "The horse was a gift," Dominic said, "from the Harrington family. Do you know who they are?" Harper shook her head. "Old money. Older grudges. Richard Harrington died 6 months ago, and his sons have been testing boundaries ever since. Onyx belonged to Richard. The family insisted I accept him as a gesture of respect." "But you don't trust their gestures?" Dominic turned, his expression sharp. "Trust is a luxury I can't afford. The horse has been a constant reminder of my limitations, until today." Harper felt the conversation shifting, becoming something larger than her small act of kindness. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to take care of Onyx, full-time, starting tomorrow." The offer hit her like cold water. "I'm not qualified." "You're the only person who's ever reached him. That qualifies you more than any degree or certification." Dominic moved back to his desk, pulling out a leather portfolio. "Your salary will triple. You'll have access to any resources you need: food, equipment, veterinary support. In return, you'll be responsible for Onyx's daily care and rehabilitation. Triple salary." Harper's mind raced through calculations: Emma's care costs, the dwindling savings account, the pressure that had been crushing her chest for months. Financial freedom, or something close to it, offered by a man she didn't understand for reasons she couldn't fathom. "Why?" she asked. "Because you succeeded where others failed. Because Onyx responds to you in ways he's never responded to anyone else. Because—" Dominic paused, and for a moment his controlled facade cracked. "Because I need this problem solved, And you're the first person to treat it like a healing instead of a conquest. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Harper sensed currents running deeper than a simple employment offer, power dynamics she didn't understand, family rivalries that stretched back generations, and something in Dominic's eyes that looked almost like desperation. "There will be conditions," he continued. "You'll live on the estate. Your movements will be monitored for security purposes. You'll report directly to me, not to the household staff, and you'll maintain absolute discretion about everything you see or hear." The golden cage revealed itself slowly. Safety and financial security, but at the cost of freedom and autonomy. Harper had escaped one form of powerlessness, only to be offered another, wrapped in luxury and good intentions. "What if I refuse?" "Then you'll receive a generous severance package and excellent references." "But Onyx—" Dominic's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Onyx will be sent to a facility that specializes in difficult cases. They have methods that are effective, if not gentle." The threat wasn't aimed at her. It was aimed at the horse who had just learned to trust again. Harper felt the familiar weight of impossible choices, the same crushing responsibility that had defined her life since Emma's accident. "I need to think about it." "You have until tomorrow morning." "But Harper?" Dominic's use of her first name felt strangely intimate. "Whatever damage that horse carries, whatever broke him, I suspect it's something you understand better than most. Don't let that understanding go to waste." Harper left the office with her mind spinning and her heart racing. The elevator descended through floors of marble and mahogany, carrying her back to the servants' quarters where her old life waited. But she could feel the change already taking root, the way opportunity and obligation twisted together until they became indistinguishable. In her small room, she sat on the narrow bed and pulled out her phone. The care facility's number stared back at her, a reminder of why impossible choices sometimes became inevitable ones. Salvation, she was learning, always came with a price. The question was whether she was strong enough to pay it. The cottage sat at the edge of the estate like an afterthought, small and pristine among the sprawling grounds. Harper stood in its doorway at dawn, coffee cooling in her hands, watching Onyx graze in the paddock 50 yards away. 3 days since she'd accepted Dominic's offer, and the surreal quality of her new life still felt like borrowed clothes, expensive but ill-fitting. The cottage had been prepared overnight. Fresh linens, a refrigerator stocked with food she'd never been able to afford, high-speed internet that connected her to Emma's care facility without the delays and dropped calls of her old phone plan. Luxury delivered with surgical efficiency, like everything else in Dominic's world. But luxury, Harper was discovering, came with its own weight. "Miss Sullivan." Marcus appeared at her elbow with the silent efficiency of expensive security. "Mr. Caruso would like to see the morning report." Harper nodded, closing the cottage door behind her. The morning report, a ritual that had emerged organically over 3 days. Onyx's behavior, eating patterns, response to different stimuli. Information that felt deeply personal, reduced to bullet points for a man who managed risk like other people, managed grocery lists. The walk to the main house took her past the formal gardens, where staff moved like ghosts among the hedgerows, maintaining perfection through invisible labor. Harper recognized the choreography. She had been part of it until recently. Now she moved through it as something else, neither servant nor family, occupying a space that didn't quite exist. Dominic's office looked the same, marble and mahogany and windows that framed power, but Harper's relationship to it had shifted. She was no longer summoned, she was expected. The difference felt significant. "How is he?" Dominic asked without preamble, not looking up from his morning papers. "Better. His startled response is decreasing. Yesterday he let me brush him without sedation." "Timeline for full recovery?" Harper hesitated. The question assumed recovery was a destination rather than a process, a problem to be solved rather than a relationship to be built. "It's not linear. Trauma doesn't follow schedules." Dominic's eyes lifted, sharp and measuring. "But there will be measurable progress." "Yes, just not predictable progress." He made a note in the margins of whatever document held his attention. Harper watched his hands, precise, controlled. the movements of someone who had learned to waste neither time nor gesture. Everything about Dominic Caruso spoke to optimization, efficiency, the ruthless elimination of variables. "The Harringtons have asked to visit," he said. The words hit Harper like cold water. "Here? Why?" "To see their gift thriving, presumably, to measure the success of their generosity." Dominic's tone carried layers of meaning Harper couldn't pass. "They've requested a demonstration, to see Onyx working with his new handler. I'm not a performer." "No, you're an investment, and like all investments, you'll occasionally need to prove your value." The casual cruelty of the statement caught Harper off guard. For 3 days she'd begun to believe that her work with Onyx mattered, beyond its monetary value to Dominic, that her understanding of trauma, her patient approach to healing, meant something more than quarterly returns. "When?" she asked. "Next week, Friday afternoon. Nothing elaborate, just a brief demonstration of Onyx's progress." Harper nodded, though something cold settled in her chest. She thought of Onyx, who was just beginning to trust, just starting to believe that human hands might offer comfort instead of control. The idea of putting that fragile progress on display felt like a betrayal. "There will be additional security," Dominic continued. "The Harringtons travel with protection. Marcus will brief you on protocols." "What kind of protocols?" "The kind that keep everyone alive." Dominic's tone suggested the conversation was over, but Harper remained seated. "Is there something you're not telling me about this family?" For the first time since she'd entered his office, Dominic gave her his full attention. His grey eyes held depths she couldn't fathom. Calculation, yes, but something else. Worry, perhaps, or fear. "The Harringtons collect things," he said finally. "Art, land, influence, people. They gave me Onyx because they wanted to see what I would do with something broken, whether I could fix it or whether it would break me." "And if they don't like what they see next Friday?" Dominic was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the mahogany desk. "Then we'll discover whether your gift extends beyond healing horses." Harper left the office with more questions than answers, and the growing certainty that her new life of luxury and safety was built on foundations she didn't understand. But walking back toward the cottage, seeing Onyx lift his head at her approach, she also felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the dangerous, intoxicating possibility that she might actually matter to someone's world. The first rainfall in weeks arrived on Thursday evening, drumming against the cottage windows like impatient fingers. Harper sat at her small kitchen table, watching water streak the glass while Onyx sheltered in the covered paddock, his dark form barely visible through the storm. Her phone buzzed. Evening report. Dominic's messages had evolved over the past week, from formal requests to terse commands. Harper typed back, "Onyx responded well to groundwork. No startle responses to sudden movements. Ready for tomorrow." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, "Need to discuss parameters for tomorrow. Main house. Now." Harper stared at the message, irritation flaring. She'd been working with trauma-affected animals since childhood. Foster homes had taught her that broken creatures often understood each other. But Dominic's need to control every variable, every outcome, was beginning to feel suffocating. The main house at night was a different creature than during the day. Soft lighting transformed harsh marble into something warmer, more human. Harper found Dominic in his private study, a smaller room adjacent to his office. Books lined the walls, not the leather-bound display pieces from his formal office, but well-worn volumes with cracked spines and bookmarked pages. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair near the fireplace. This time Harper sat. The flames cast shadows across Dominic's face, softening the sharp angles that daylight revealed. He looked tired, she realized, not physically exhausted, but worn down by some weight he carried alone. "The Harringtons will arrive at 2, he began. "James and Victoria, Richard's surviving children. They'll want to see Onyx performing, standing, walking, responding to commands." "That's not how this works." Harper's voice was sharper than intended. "Onyx isn't a trained dog. He's learning to trust again. Performance anxiety could undo weeks of progress. And yet performance is what tomorrow requires. Harper studied Dominic's profile in the firelight. His control wasn't just about power, she realized. It was about survival. The careful orchestration, the measured responses, the way he anticipated problems before they emerged. Someone had taught him that chaos meant death. "What happened to you?" she asked quietly. Dominic's hands stilled on the bourbon glass he'd been turning. "Excuse me? You move through the world like someone expects an attack. That kind of hypervigilance, and it comes from experience." For a moment, Harper thought he might answer. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps recognition. But the moment passed, and his features returned to their customary composure. "My personal history isn't relevant to tomorrow's demonstration. It is if you want me to understand what we're really facing." Dominic stood and moved to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. "The Harringtons killed my father." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Harper felt their weight, their finality. "Not directly," Dominic continued. "They engineered a business deal that put him in the wrong place at the wrong time, arranged for information to reach the wrong people, made sure he was standing on a particular dock in Oakland on a particular night 26 years ago. You were 12, old enough to understand that power without protection is just elaborate suicide." Dominic turned back toward her, his eyes reflecting firelight. "My mother spent the next 15 years looking over her shoulder, working herself to death to keep us invisible enough to survive." Harper felt something shift between them, not softening exactly, but a recognition of shared damage. They both knew what it meant to lose everything, to rebuild from pieces that never quite fit together the same way. "So tomorrow isn't about Onyx's progress," she said. "Tomorrow is about proving that what they broke can be fixed, that their gifts don't carry the poison they intended." Harper stood, moving closer to the window where Dominic waited. Outside, lightning illuminated the paddock, where Onyx stood motionless, unbothered by the storm. "He trusts me because I don't try to control his fear," she said. "I acknowledge it, work around it, let him choose his own pace." "And what does that teach us about tomorrow? That maybe the best way to prove their gift didn't poison you is to show them something they can't control, genuine healing instead of forced compliance." Dominic was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the reflected firelight. "You're suggesting we go off script?" "I'm suggesting we let Onyx be himself. Trauma doesn't perform on command, but recovery. Recovery can be its own kind of strength." When Dominic smiled, really smiled, not the calculated expression he wore for business, Harper glimpsed the boy who had learned too early that trust was dangerous, but also the man who was beginning to suspect it might be necessary. "Then we do this your way," he said. "But Harper, if this goes wrong, it won't. How can you be certain?" Harper looked out at Onyx, steady in the storm. "Because broken recognizes broken. And sometimes that's exactly what healing needs." The Harringtons arrived in a convoy that whispered money, 3 black sedans with tinted windows that reflected the afternoon sun like armor. Harper watched from the stable window as they disembarked with the casual arrogance of people who had never doubted their welcome anywhere. James Harrington looked like his father's photograph come to life. Silver hair, sharp suit, eyes that catalogued weakness with predatory efficiency. Victoria moved beside him with liquid grace, her designer clothes and perfect makeup, a weapon disguised as fashion. They brought an entourage, a lawyer, a photographer, and 2 men whose stillness marked them as professional violence wrapped in expensive suits. "Showtime," Harper murmured to Onyx, who stood quietly in his paddock, unaware that his peaceful grazing had become a battlefield. Dominic emerged from the main house with Marcus at his side, his own armor of control perfectly fitted. The 2 groups met on the wide terrace overlooking the grounds, a careful choreography of power and courtesy that fooled no one. From her position by the stable, Harper could see but not hear the initial pleasantries. Handshakes that lasted precise seconds, smiles that never reached anyone's eyes, the subtle positioning that marked territory without words. She felt like a sniper in the wings, waiting for her moment to either save the performance or watch it explode. Josephine, the head housekeeper, appeared at Harper's elbow with a tray of refreshments. "They asked specifically about you," she said quietly. Harper turned, studying the older woman's carefully neutral expression. What kind of questions? Your background. How long you've been here. Whether you have family. Josephine's voice carried undertones Harper couldn't quite identify. I told them you keep to yourself. Something cold settled in Harper's stomach. Why would they care about my family? Josephine shrugged, but her eyes didn't meet Harper's. Rich people like to know everything, makes them feel safer. The conversation felt wrong, too casual, too probing. Harper filed the discomfort away as Dominic's group began moving toward the paddock. Time to focus on what mattered, keeping Onyx calm while powerful people played games with higher stakes than she understood. The demonstration itself went better than Harper had dared hope. Onyx responded to her quiet commands, allowed her to lead him around the paddock, even stood still while she brushed his coat. No theatrics, no forced tricks, just a horse learning to trust again, healing made visible. Victoria Harrington watched with keen interest, her photographer capturing every moment. He's quite different from how Father described him, she said to Dominic. Father said he was completely unmanageable. Animals respond to understanding, Harper replied, before Dominic could answer. Maybe your father was using the wrong approach. The silence that followed felt dangerous. Victoria's smile sharpened into something that could cut glass. How interesting. And you've worked with traumatized horses before? Harper felt the trap opening beneath her feet. Some. Where? What facility? Before Harper could fumble for an answer that wouldn't reveal her lack of formal training, Dominic stepped forward. Miss Sullivan's methods speak for themselves. As you can see, James Harrington spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of old money and older grudges. Indeed, quite remarkable progress for someone so young. Tell me, Miss Sullivan, do you have family in the area? The question landed like ice water. Harper's training in invisibility screamed warnings, but she was trapped in the spotlight of their attention. Some? Local? Close enough. Victoria and James exchanged a look that lasted a heartbeat too long. Their photographer, Harper noticed, had shifted position to capture not just Onyx, but the cottage in the background, the grounds, the sightlines. Well, Victoria said brightly, this has been absolutely fascinating. Dominic, you must be so pleased with your investment. After they left, Harper found herself shaking, not from fear, but from something deeper, the recognition that she had been catalogued, measured, possibly targeted by people who collected leverage the way others collected art. Dominic approached her in the paddock where she was brushing Onyx with perhaps more intensity than necessary. You did well. They weren't here to see Onyx. No, they weren't. Harper stopped brushing, her hand resting on Onyx's warm flank. What did they really want? To confirm that I care about something they can destroy. Dominic's voice was quiet, dangerous. And to make sure you understand that your value to me makes you valuable to them. That evening, Harper's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Your sister Emma is lovely. Such a peaceful place, that care facility. Would hate for anything to disturb her recovery. The phone slipped from Harper's fingers, clattering to the cottage floor. Outside, Onyx whinnied softly, sensing her distress across the distance that no longer felt like protection. The game had changed. She was no longer invisible, no longer safe, no longer just a woman healing a horse. She had become a piece on a board, where the stakes were measured in blood and the players had been moving pieces long before she learned the rules existed. The Napa Valley Wine Consortium's annual charity gala transformed the Caruso estate into a stage where California's elite performed their annual ritual of competitive generosity. Harper watched from her cottage window as valets parked Bentleys and Maseratis in neat rows, their chrome gleaming under strings of Edison bulbs that turned the vineyards into something magical. She hadn't been invited, of course, but Dominic had made it clear her presence was required, not as a guest, but as a living testament to his success. The Harringtons will be there, he'd said that morning. They'll expect to see evidence that their gift has been properly managed. At 8 o'clock, Harper led Onyx from his paddock toward the main house. The stallion moved with calm confidence now, his terror replaced by something approaching contentment. 3 weeks of patient work had transformed him from a broken creature into something beautiful. a walking rebuke to everyone who had tried to fix him through force. The crowd gathered on the terrace was a constellation of power, tech billionaires from Silicon Valley, generational vineyard owners, politicians whose votes could be purchased with sufficient contributions to their preferred charities. Harper recognized the choreography of wealth, the careful positioning, the calculated conversations, the way information flowed through expensive smiles and designer handshakes. Dominic stood near the main entrance, immaculate in his tuxedo, accepting congratulations on his remarkable success with the Harrington horse. Harper approached with Onyx, acutely aware of how her simple riding clothes marked her as help rather than guest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dominic's voice carried across the terrace with practiced authority, "I'd like you to meet the real success story of this evening." All eyes turned toward Harper and Onyx. The Stallion, sensing the attention, remained calm, a testimony to the trust they'd built together. Harper felt the weight of scrutiny from California's most powerful people, their assessment both clinical and dismissive. 6 months ago, Dominic continued, this horse was considered unmanageable by every expert we consulted. Tonight, he stands before you as proof that understanding can succeed where force fails. The applause was polite, perfunctory. Harper caught sight of Victoria Harrington near the bar, her smile sharp as winter sunlight. James stood beside her, his expression unreadable. "Miss Sullivan," Victoria's voice cut through the murmur of conversation as she approached. "How lovely to see you again. Tell me, how is your sister doing?" The question landed like a slap. Harper felt every conversation around them pause, felt the subtle shift in attention as the crowd sensed blood in the water. "She's fine." Such a challenging condition, traumatic brain injury, so expensive to manage properly. Victoria's voice carried just loud enough for nearby listeners to catch the implications. "I imagine it puts tremendous pressure on families." Harper understood the game now. Victoria wasn't making conversation, she was making a point, demonstrating that Dominic's success was built on Harper's desperation, that his triumph was purchased with someone else's vulnerability. "Fortunately," Victoria continued, "Miss Sullivan has found such generous employment. It must be comforting to know that your sister's care is secured by your position here." The words hung in the air like smoke. Harper felt the crowd's assessment shift, saw understanding dawn in expensive eyes. She wasn't a skilled professional who had achieved something remarkable. She was a desperate woman who had been bought with promises of help for her disabled sister. Dominic moved closer, his presence both protective and possessive. "Miss Sullivan's methods speak for themselves." "Oh, absolutely," James interjected, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of old money. "Though one wonders about the sustainability of arrangements based on personal circumstances rather than professional qualifications." The attack was surgical, designed to wound without appearing to do so. Harper felt her accomplishment with Onyx being reframed as charity, her expertise dismissed as desperation, her value reduced to her willingness to be owned. "The beautiful thing about healing," Harper said quietly, "is that it doesn't depend on credentials. It depends on understanding what's broken and having the patience to help it remember what whole feels like." She looked directly at Victoria as she spoke, letting the words carry their own weight. Around them, the conversation resumed, but Harper felt the damage spreading like ripples through expensive water. By tomorrow, everyone would know that Dominic Caruso's success was built on the labor of a woman desperate enough to accept any conditions. As the evening wound down, Harper led Onyx back toward his paddock. Behind them, the gala continued its glittering performance, but the stage had been reset. She was no longer invisible help or skilled professional. She had become something more dangerous in their world, a person with agency who refused to be diminished by their assessment. The war, she realized, had moved from the shadows into the light, and she was no longer just a bystander. The call came at 3 in the morning, Dominic's voice sharp with urgency cutting through Harper's sleep. "Get dressed. We're leaving. Now." Harper stumbled from bed, her mind still thick with exhaustion. Through her cottage window, she could see vehicles with headlights blazing in the circular drive, figures moving with military precision. "What's happening?" Emma's facility was broken into tonight. Nothing stolen, but her room was searched. They left a photograph on her nightstand. You and Onyx from yesterday's demonstration. The words hit Harper like ice water. She was pulling on clothes before Dominic finished speaking, her hands shaking as she yanked boots over bare feet. Is she hurt? No, but the message is clear. Get to the car. The drive to Fresno stretched through darkness, punctuated by Marcus's quiet radio checks with advanced security teams. Harper sat rigid in the passenger seat of Dominic's Range Rover, watching mile markers blur past while her sister's vulnerable face played behind her closed eyelids. "This is my fault," Dominic said finally, his voice carrying a weight she'd never heard before. "I underestimated how far they'd go to hurt me." "No." Harper's response was automatic, born from years of carrying blame that belonged to her alone. "This is mine. I should have walked away when you first made the offer." "Harper, you told me there would be risks. I thought you meant risks to me, not to her." Harper's voice cracked on the last word. She's completely helpless. Her mind resets every few hours. She can't understand why strangers were in her room touching her things. They found Emma curled in her bed, awake but confused, clutching the framed photo that had been left like a calling card. Harper gathered her sister into her arms, feeling how small she'd become, how fragile. "Harper." Emma's voice carried the bewildered quality that never quite faded. "There were people here. They said they knew you." "I know, sweetheart. But they're gone now. They looked at my pictures, moved my things." Emma pulled back to study Harper's face with the intense concentration that was both heartbreaking and familiar. "Are you in trouble?" The question cut deeper than any threat the Harringtons could have made. Harper realized that her decision to accept Dominic's offer, made in desperation and justified as necessity, had dragged the one person she was supposed to protect into a war she didn't understand. "No," Harper lied smoothly. "Just some confusion. Nothing you need to worry about." But when she left Emma's room 20 minutes later, Harper's resolve had crystallized into something hard and unforgiving. She found Dominic in the hallway, his expensive suit incongruous in the sterile institutional lighting. "I'm leaving," she said without preamble. "The facility has agreed to increase security, triple shifts, background checks on all new staff. I'm leaving the job. Tonight." Dominic's expression shifted from concern to something sharper, more calculating. "That's exactly what they want. If you run now, they win. If I stay, Emma becomes a permanent target. That's not acceptable. So we find another solution. Move her to a private facility somewhere with better security." "With what money?" Harper's voice rose before she caught herself, conscious of the patients sleeping nearby. "I took your job because I was desperate. Now I'm walking away for the same reason. You're being emotional. I'm being responsible." Harper stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more force than shouting. "You collect broken things, Dominic. Horses, people, problems you think you can solve with enough money and control. But some things can't be fixed by owning them." The words hit their target. Dominic's face went carefully blank, the expression she'd learned to recognize as his defense against emotional damage. "3 weeks ago, you were invisible," he said quietly. "Going back to that won't protect her. They know about Emma now. They know she matters to you. Walking away just means facing them without resources." "Maybe. But at least I'll face them as myself, not as your employee." Harper turned to leave, but Dominic's voice stopped her. "Is that what you think this is? Employment?" She looked back at him, this powerful, controlled man standing in a fluorescent hallway at 4 in the morning because her sister had been threatened. For a moment, she glimpsed something beyond calculation in his eyes, something that looked almost like pain. "I don't know what this is," she admitted, "but I know what it costs. And I can't afford it." Harper left him standing in that sterile corridor, surrounded by the expensive security he'd purchased to protect someone else's vulnerability. The drive back to Napa felt like retreat, but also like the first choice she'd made in months that belonged entirely to her. By dawn, she was packing the cottage that had never quite felt like home, preparing to disappear back into the invisible margins where broken people learned to survive. Harper's new apartment sat above a bakery in downtown Napa, its windows facing an alley where delivery trucks unloaded before dawn. The space was small, anonymous, and paid for with the severance check Dominic had deposited in her account despite her protests. She'd tried to return the money. The bank had informed her the account was frozen for her protection, accessible only for Emma's care and Harper's basic needs. Even in departure, he was trying to control her survival. 2 weeks had passed since she'd left the estate. 2 weeks of working double shifts at a veterinary clinic in Sonoma, sleeping on an air mattress, and avoiding the news reports that tracked the escalating corporate war between Caruso Holdings and Harrington Industries. The business pages chronicled hostile takeover attempts, strategic partnerships dissolved overnight, and stock prices that fluctuated with each new salvo in their private conflict. Harper tried not to care, tried to focus on the animals that came through the clinic's doors. Cats with infected wounds, dogs with broken bones, horses with colic, problems that had solutions, pain that could be healed with patience and skill. But late at night, when the city settled into silence, she found herself thinking about Onyx, about whether his newfound trust had survived her absence, or whether the careful work they'd built together had crumbled without her daily presence. On Thursday afternoon, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Your replacement lasted 3 days. Onyx hasn't eaten since Tuesday." Harper stared at the message, her chest tightening. She'd known leaving would be difficult for the horse, but she'd hoped his healing had progressed enough to survive the transition. The image of him standing alone in his paddock, refusing food, waiting for someone who wouldn't return, cut through her resolution like a blade. She was reaching for her keys when another text arrived. "Not asking you to come back. Just thought you should know." The sender remained anonymous, but Harper recognized the tone. Direct, factual, stripped of emotional manipulation. Marcus, probably, or one of the other security staff who had watched her work with Onyx. Instead of driving to the estate, Harper made a different choice. She called Dr. Sarah Chen, the veterinarian who had consulted on Onyx's case during the early weeks of Harper's employment. They met at a coffee shop in St. Helena, where Dr. Chen's assessment was blunt and professional. "Horses like Onyx don't forget their primary attachment figures easily," she said over her espresso. "If he's refusing food, it's not manipulation, it's grief. So he'll adjust? Maybe. Or maybe he'll slip back into the trauma patterns you spent weeks helping him overcome." Dr. Chen studied Harper's face with clinical precision. "The question is whether you can live with that possibility." Harper spent that evening walking through downtown Napa, past wine bars filled with tourists and restaurants where she couldn't afford to eat. The town hummed with prosperity she'd never been part of, a world of casual wealth that treated people like her as scenery. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't trying to be invisible. The Harringtons had stripped away that luxury. By threatening Emma, by turning Harper's story into gossip at charity galas, by making her existence a weapon in their war against Dominic, they had forced her into visibility. She could no longer disappear into the background and hope safety would follow. That realization brought something unexpected: anger. Not the cold despair she'd carried since leaving the estate, but a hot, clean fury at being reduced to a pawn in someone else's game. Harper stopped walking and pulled out her phone. This time she called a different number, the care facility where Emma lived. "I want to speak to Dr. Rodriguez," she told the night supervisor, "about security protocols and family notification procedures." The conversation that followed was clinical, thorough, and entirely Harper's own choice. She arranged for daily updates on Emma's condition, established new emergency contacts, and authorized specific security measures. Not the overwhelming protection Dominic had offered, but careful, proportional responses to realistic threats. When she finished, Harper felt something she hadn't experienced in months: agency. The power to make decisions based on her own assessment rather than someone else's control. Her phone buzzed again. Harrington Industries filed permits for new construction adjacent to the estate, breaking ground Monday. This time, Harper didn't delete the message or try to ignore its implications. Instead, she opened her laptop and began researching construction permits, zoning laws, and the complex web of regulations that governed land use in Napa Valley. If the Harringtons wanted to play games with other people's lives, they would discover that Harper Sullivan was no longer content to be a piece on their board. She was learning to move herself, and pieces that moved on their own had a way of changing the entire game. The package arrived on Saturday morning with no return address, a small wooden box wrapped in brown paper left on the bakery's doorstep, while Harper worked her shift at the clinic. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a carved horse no bigger than her palm. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Flowing mane, proud neck, eyes that seemed to hold intelligence and sorrow in equal measure. Harper recognized the artist's work. Maria Santos, a local woodcarver whose pieces sold in Napa's tourist galleries for hundreds of dollars. But this horse hadn't come from a gallery. The base bore a simple inscription, "For Emma from Onyx." Harper turned the carving over in her hands, feeling the smooth grain of what looked like olive wood, probably from one of the estate's own groves. Someone had taken time to commission this piece, to think about what might bring comfort to a young woman whose world had been invaded by strangers with cameras and threats. Her phone buzzed. Emma loved the horse. "She's carrying it everywhere." The text came from an unknown number, but Harper suspected Dr. Rodriguez at the care facility. The fact that someone was updating her without her asking suggested coordination she hadn't arranged. That evening, Harper drove to the estate. Not to the main house or the cottage she'd abandoned, but to the overlook where hiking trails offered a view of the entire property. She parked along the public road and walked the half-mile to the viewpoint, needing to see for herself what the Harringtons' construction permits meant. The valley spread below her in the golden light of late afternoon. Vineyards in neat rows, the main house gleaming white against green hills, and in the distance the paddock where she could just make out a dark figure standing motionless by the fence. Onyx. Even from this distance his posture spoke of waiting, of hope deferred but not abandoned. "He stands there every evening around this time." Harper spun, her heart jumping at the unexpected voice. Dominic stood 20 feet away, his hands in the pockets of worn jeans that looked strange on a man she'd only seen in expensive suits. He looked thinner than she remembered, his usual polish replaced by something more human. "I'm not trespassing," she said automatically. "I know. This is public land." He moved closer, stopping just beyond arm's reach. "Thank you for the veterinary recommendations. Dr. Martinez has been helpful." Harper nodded, unsure how to navigate this unexpected encounter. The carved horse was thoughtful. Maria Santos said it was important to capture his spirit, not just his appearance. She spent 3 hours observing him before she started carving. They stood in silence, watching the valley settle into evening shadows. Harper felt the weight of everything unsaid between them. Her abrupt departure, his attempts to maintain control from a distance, the careful dance they'd been performing around their mutual damage. "The construction permits," she said finally. "What are they planning?" "A processing facility. Harrington Industries filed to build an agricultural processing plant on the adjacent property. 24-hour operations, heavy truck traffic, industrial noise." Dominic's voice was carefully neutral. "They bought the land 2 weeks ago, through a shell corporation." Harper understood immediately. The facility wouldn't just be an annoyance. The constant noise and disruption would undo everything she'd accomplished with Onyx. The horse's recovery depended on predictability, quiet, the absence of triggers that might send him spiraling back into trauma. "Can you fight it?" "I'm trying. But they've followed all the regulations, paid the appropriate fees. Money has a way of smoothing bureaucratic processes." Harper watched Onyx lift his head as if sensing their presence across the distance. The horse took a few steps toward the fence closest to the overlook, then stopped, his dark coat catching the last rays of sunlight. "He's not eating regularly," Dominic continued. "Dr. Martinez says it's behavioral, not medical. He suggests that trauma bonds can be stronger than survival instinct, especially in cases where trust was hard won." The words weren't quite an apology, but they carried weight beyond their clinical meaning. Harper understood that she was being told, not asked. The information was offered without expectation or demand. "I could consult," she heard herself say. "Not return to the job, but assess his condition, make recommendations." Dominic was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes studying her face in the fading light. What would that look like? Professional arrangement, specific scope, limited duration. I maintain my independence, you get expert evaluation. And Emma? Harper felt something shift in her chest, not the familiar weight of responsibility, but something lighter. Choice, freely made. Emma has the security she needs, and she loves the horse you sent her. When Dominic smiled, really smiled, without calculation or agenda, Harper glimpsed the boy who had learned too young that trust was dangerous, and the man who was slowly learning it might be necessary. Tomorrow, he asked. Tomorrow. The Napa County Planning Commission meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, in a beige conference room that smelled of burnt coffee and bureaucratic indifference. Harper arrived early, her research printed and organized in manila folders that cost more than she usually spent on groceries in a week. She'd spent 3 sleepless nights digging through public records, environmental impact studies, and construction permits. What she'd found wasn't criminal. The Harringtons were too smart for outright illegality, but it was damning in subtler ways. Dominic sat in the back row, his presence noted by the commissioners, but his participation deliberately minimal. This was Harper's strategy, her fight, waged with weapons he couldn't wield. Public testimony, environmental law, and the kind of grassroots organizing that money couldn't easily counter. Next item, Commissioner Martinez announced, Harrington Industries application for industrial processing permit, case number 2024-387. Victoria Harrington approached the podium with her lawyer, both dressed in the kind of understated luxury that suggested competence and respectability. Her presentation was polished, professional, hitting all the regulatory requirements with practiced precision. The facility will provide 75 jobs to local residents, she concluded, while maintaining full compliance with environmental and noise standards. Harper waited for the public comment period, her heart steady despite the stakes. When her name was called, she approached the microphone with the confidence of someone who had done her homework. My name is Harper Sullivan. I'm speaking today not as an opponent of economic development, but as someone concerned about the environmental and social impact of this project. She opened her first folder. The proposed facility borders the Carneros Creek watershed, which provides drinking water to 3 local communities. While the environmental impact study claims minimal disruption, it fails to account for the cumulative effect of 24-hour operations on groundwater filtration. Commissioner Rodriguez leaned forward. Can you elaborate? The impact study was conducted during the dry season, when water tables are at their lowest. It doesn't reflect the seasonal flooding patterns that could carry industrial runoff directly into the creek system. Harper felt the room's attention sharpen. I've cross-referenced 5 years of hydrological data that suggests significant risk to water quality. Victoria's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, but Harper wasn't finished. Additionally, the noise impact assessment was conducted with decibel measurements from equipment that won't actually be used. The facility will employ industrial crushers that generate sound levels 15% higher than what was tested. Harper opened her second folder. This matters because the adjacent property houses a specialized rehabilitation program for traumatized animals. The sustained noise levels would effectively destroy years of therapeutic work. What kind of rehabilitation program? Commissioner Martinez asked. Harper glanced toward Dominic, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Horses primarily, animals recovering from abuse, neglect, and trauma-related behavioral disorders. The program has achieved remarkable success rates precisely because of the quiet, controlled environment. And you have expertise in this area? I do. I've worked extensively with trauma recovery in both animals and humans. What people don't always understand is that healing requires safety. Not just physical safety, but environmental predictability. Chronic stress from industrial noise would trigger the same neurological responses that created the original trauma. Harper pulled out photographs she'd taken during her work with Onyx, before and after images that showed his transformation from a terrorized creature to a calm, trusting horse. This is what recovery looks like when the environment supports healing instead of disrupting it. The room was quiet, the commissioners studying the photographs with interest. Harper continued. But there's something else the commission should know. Harrington Industries owns 17 properties in Napa County. None of them currently house industrial processing facilities. This application isn't about optimal location for operations. It's about strategic positioning relative to one specific neighbor. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. That's speculation. It's fact, Harper interrupted gently. Public records show that Harrington Industries approached 4 other potential sites with better transportation access and lower environmental impact. They chose this location specifically because of its proximity to the Caruso estate. Commissioner Rodriguez shuffled through his papers. Ms. Harrington, can you address these concerns? Victoria's response was technically accurate but emotionally hollow, a lawyer's answer to an emotional question. Harper watched the commissioner's expressions shift from routine approval to genuine consideration. The vote, when it came, was 4-1 against the permit. Outside the building, Victoria Harrington approached Harper with cold fury barely contained beneath her professional exterior. "This isn't over," she said quietly. Harper met her gaze without flinching. "Yes, it is. You wanted to prove that broken things couldn't be healed, but some breaks just make us stronger in different places." As Victoria walked away, Harper felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of winning a fight she'd chosen to enter on her own terms. 3 months later, Harper stood at the edge of Onyx's paddock, watching him move with the fluid confidence of a horse who had remembered what peace felt like. The morning sun painted the valley gold, and the only sounds were birdsong and the gentle whisper of wind through the olive groves. The rehabilitation program had grown beyond her wildest expectations. 6 horses now grazed in expanded paddocks, each one carrying its own story of trauma and recovery. The cottage had been renovated into a proper facility with medical equipment, training areas, and space for the volunteers who came twice weekly to learn Harper's methods. "The documentary crew wants to interview you again," Dominic said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "Something about the national broadcast." Harper accepted the coffee, inhaling the rich aroma of beans that still felt like luxury, even after months of access to them. The PBS documentary about animal-assisted therapy had featured their program prominently, bringing inquiries from across the country and validation Harper had never expected. "I still can't believe we're booked through next year." "I can." Dominic's voice carried quiet pride. "You've built something remarkable here." They stood in comfortable silence, watching Onyx investigate a new toy one of the volunteers had brought, a large rubber ball that squeaked when pushed. The horse who had once been paralyzed by terror now played with curious intelligence, his fear transformed into appropriate caution. "Emma called yesterday," Harper said. "She wants to visit next week." "How is she adjusting to the new facility?" "Better than I hoped. The move to the private care center was—" Harper paused, still amazed by the transformation in her sister's quality of life. "It's everything I wanted for her, but never thought we could afford." The endowment Dominic had established covered Emma's care completely, but not as charity, as payment for Harper's work developing the rehabilitation program. The legal structure preserved Harper's dignity while ensuring Emma's future, a solution that felt like grace rather than obligation. "She loves the horse you sent," Harper continued. "Dr. Rodriguez says she tells everyone about her sister, who heals horses with magic." Dominic smiled. "Maybe she's not wrong about the magic part." A truck pulled into the drive, Dr. Martinez arriving for the weekly health assessments. The veterinarian had become a crucial partner in the program, helping develop protocols that other facilities could replicate. "The California Animal Welfare Board wants to fund expansion," Dominic said, as they watched Dr. Martinez unload equipment. "Build a teaching center, train more practitioners. That's a big commitment." "The biggest decisions usually are." Harper looked at him, studying the man who had evolved from controlling employer to trusted partner over the months of working together. Their relationship had found its own rhythm, professional collaboration built on mutual respect, personal connection that grew stronger for being chosen rather than imposed. "There's something else," Dominic continued. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, thick and formal. "Onyx's ownership papers." Harper's breath caught. "What?" "He's yours. Legally. Officially, Completely. Dominic's grey eyes were serious, but warm. No conditions, no strings, just the recognition that some bonds can't be owned, only honoured. Harper opened the envelope with trembling fingers, scanning the legal documents that transferred ownership of a horse worth more than most people's houses. At the bottom, in Dominic's careful handwriting, was a note: "For showing me that power doesn't have to mean control. I can't accept this." "You already have. The papers were filed last week." "Dominic." "You taught me something I'd forgotten," he said quietly. "My mother used to say that the best gifts aren't the ones we can afford to give, but the ones we can't afford to keep. Onyx belongs with you. He always has." Harper felt tears she hadn't expected, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gesture and what it represented. Not ownership changing hands, but trust so complete it required no boundaries. "There's one more thing." Dominic gestured toward the renovated cottage. "The program needs a permanent director, someone with vision, expertise, and the patience to build something that will outlast both of us." Harper looked around at the peaceful valley, the healing horses, the life she'd built from the ashes of her old invisibility. For the first time since Emma's accident, she could envision a future that extended beyond mere survival. "Yes," she said simply. As they walked back toward the cottage, toward the life they were building together, separate but connected, Onyx whinnied softly behind them, a sound of contentment that carried across the valley like a promise that broken things, given time and gentleness, could indeed learn to trust again. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Hit like and comment below what you thought. See you in the next video.